You're listening to a special episode of Energy Insiders, produced in partnership with Gilbert Tobin as part of its Beyond Transition series, financing the next phase of the energy transition. Your host is Renew Economy's Editor-in-Chief, Giles Parkinson.
Hello, I'm Giles Parkinson. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Renew Economy. Much of Australia's energy transition debate has focused on electricity, renewables, transmission, batteries and the grid. But there's another part of the transition that's arguably just as important, and one that receives far less attention: the future of liquid fuels. Australia currently imports around 90% of its liquid fuel requirements, including virtually all of the jet fuel that keeps our aviation sector moving. And as the world decarbonises, sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, is emerging as one of the most significant opportunities to strengthen energy security, reduce emissions and build a new domestic industry. But turning that opportunity into reality raises some big questions. Can Australia build a globally competitive SAF industry? What will it take to attract investment? How do projects become bankable? And what role should governments, airlines, investors and industry play in creating the demand certainty needed to unlock the capital needed? And as Gilbert and Tobin explores in its Beyond Transition series, the challenge isn't just the technology alone, it's creating the policy settings, revenue certainty and investment framework that allows projects to move from ambition to execution. And we have a great team joining us to discuss that in this special podcast. And first off, I'd just like to introduce James Guthrie, a partner in the Energy Resources and Infrastructure Group at Gilbert Tobin. Welcome, Jamie.
Good to be here.
Mac Irvine, the CFO of sustainable fuels company Jet Zero. Mac, thanks for joining us.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
And we have Céline Parle, who's head of sustainable energy fuels at Airbus. Welcome, Céline.
Thanks for having me.
And we've got also Ilona Millar, also part of the energy team and lead on the climate and sustainability team for Gilbert and Tobin. Hello, Ilona.
Hi, good to see you, Giles.
Let's get this started with Jamie. Look, as mentioned in the introduction, as we decarbonise the grid, we turn to see other parts of the economy that we need to decarbonise. I guess in the ACT, which has already reached 100% renewables, at least notionally, on a net basis, now transport's their biggest contributor to their emissions profile, and I guess that's going to be the same for the rest of the country as their grids decarbonise too. Just put us into context, give some sort of context for us about aircraft emissions and the role that sustainable aviation fuels might actually play in that.
Yeah, thanks, Giles. Look, I think if you look at the energy transition to date, the focus has been squarely on the decarbonisation of the national grid. And what I mean by that is the focus has been on solar, wind, and obviously batteries to date. But as we get to the juncture we find ourselves and we look at our energy roadmap and the net zero targets we're trying to achieve, we need to look at the broader economy and how we can achieve those targets. And so we just put it into context. I think in 2024, 91% of Australia's primary energy use came from fossil fuels and only 9% came from renewable sources. And what that means really is that we remain structurally dominant on and reliant on liquid fuels to run our economy. And what I mean by that is you touched upon, we're talking about aviation, we're talking about international shipping, we're talking about heavy freight and mining and remote operations. And when you look at it in that context, it means that we need to build out our energy portfolio by introducing energy solutions that basically can touch upon and decarbonize those sectors and those use classes which electrification can't reach, in particularly batteries. So the energy transition really isn't just about electrons, and I've said this a number of times recently, but it's not a single track, it's also about molecules.
Yeah. No.
SAF has a big part to play now, of course.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We do think that electrons are the solution for everything, but obviously molecules and green and clean molecules have that important role to play. Celine, maybe I can just bring you in here and just explain why planes can't fly forever on batteries or hydrogen or whatever else that might be. I mean, I see reports about short-haul aircraft maybe being able to fly on batteries, but I guess that's not the case for longer-haul aircraft. Simply distances too far, batteries too heavy. Airbus presumably has looked at all these different technologies.
Yeah, that's right. And look, aviation is one of the hard-to-abate sector. So at the end of the day, we need to look at a range of solutions and not just focus on one. And it is also a question of time horizon. You mentioned batteries, this hydrogen, and they're all very interesting technologies. And Airbus is investing in them. However, for the short to medium term, these technologies will not be able to be used in long-haul aviation. And when I say long-haul aviation, is flights over 4,000 kilometers or flights over 6 hours. So pretty much most of international flights from Australia are long-haul. And this is where the majority of the emissions are coming from. So when it comes to battery, the energy density of a battery is too low to be able to fly a long-haul flight. The weight of a battery that's required to power a long-haul flight would simply be too heavy. Liquid fuels, in comparison, has a much higher energy density than even the best batteries. Then for hydrogen, it's a different problem. It's a volume problem. The volume required to store the quantities required. That's what poses the problem. And so this is why you see the designs of potential future hydrogen aircrafts with those blended wings, is to create the space to store the hydrogen. And in both cases, so in the case of battery or hydrogen, significant changes would need to be made throughout the value chain. So at airports, with logistics, supply chains, etc. So it's not that they're not interesting technologies, but they will come in later. And they will not allow us to reach our short to medium term climate targets.
Yeah.
Also, commercial aircrafts have an asset life of over 30 years. So that means that the aircrafts entering in service today, or even the ones that are being ordered today, will still be flying by 2050. So SAF has a benefit of being a drop-in fuel and will not require any changes to the aircraft or the airport infrastructure. So that's why the development of SAF is so critical for today's efforts for aviation decarbonisation.
It's really interesting what you say about the drop-in fuel, but that basically means that most of the technologies built under the sustainable energy fuels sort of technologies can just be accommodated along with existing fuels and with existing engines and things like that.
That's right.
It's a bit ironic. We often hear people talking about the grid, the market operator talking about the transition in the grid, saying it's a bit like trying to change your engines while you're in midair. But I guess that's actually something that the aviation industry doesn't actually want to try and do. So
Yes, absolutely not.
Yeah. Mac, you're working on a couple of technologies. I mean, I guess tell us about the sort of the ability to be drop-in fuels, and just tell us about you've got a couple of really interesting projects that you guys are working on. Tell us more about those.
Yeah, happy to. And look, just quickly before getting into the project, just sort of 60 seconds of background on Jet Zero. We're a project developer based in Australia. And ultimately, we're looking to develop projects, both sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel, noting that the technologies are quite flexible and can produce more than just one output. So we've got two projects under development in Australia at the moment, Project Ulysses and Project Mandala. Project Ulysses utilises what's known as the alcohol to jet pathway, or ATJ, and Project Mandala utilises the HEFA pathway, which is short for hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. And essentially what each of the projects does is the ATJ pathway takes bioethanol as the feedstock and converts that into SAF and renewable diesel, whereas the HEFA pathway takes oils, fats and lipids and those sorts of feedstocks to also convert it into SAF and renewable diesel. Project Ulysses is based in Townsville. It's a place called the Cleveland Bay Industrial Precinct. And that is today, it's Australia's most advanced SAF project, currently in what's known as front-end engineering and design, or FEED for short. As I mentioned, utilising the alcohol to jet pathway. And the reason why we chose the Cleveland Bay Industrial Precinct in Townsville is it's a very strategic location. First of all, it's a heavy industrial zone. So in terms of building what is essentially a biorefinery and working through the approvals and permitting pathway, developing a project in that style of location and that sort of zoning is really important to get through those approvals as quickly as you possibly can. It's also really close to the port, which is really supported from a logistics perspective. So that includes getting your feedstocks in and your SAF renewable diesel out, as well as the ability to modularize your key plant and equipment offshore, which reduces time, cost, and risk, and then bring that to the facility once constructed. It's also really important from a fuel security perspective. So in Townsville, you've got the Laverick Barracks about 10 kilometres from our site, which has a very strong defence personnel holding there. And you've also got the RAF Townsville site about 20 kilometres away. So we see the ability for us to be producing SAF and renewable diesel as really important for our defence forces, not just within Townsville, but across the country more broadly, given some of the challenges we've seen from a geopolitical perspective in terms of fuel security. And Jamie mentioned a minute ago, depending upon which day of the week it is, but typically anywhere from 85% or more of Australia's liquid fuels are imported, which is a sovereign vulnerability effectively. And then from a jobs perspective, that's also really important too. So we're talking about 1,000 jobs during construction at peak and 100 ongoing operational jobs, and particularly for rural and regional communities, that's really, really important to be delivering those sorts of jobs. And the final point is that the Queensland government released the Accelerating Fuel Infrastructure Program earlier this year, which is all about sort of a proposal-led market process for people looking to support both refining and storage in Queensland. And Port of Townsville was one of those strategic sites to do that. And then touching on Project Mandala quickly, so there's lots of similar characteristics and sort of the broader strategy within Jet Zero. Whilst it's a different technology and different pathway, that's obviously diversifying our business across 2 different projects, 2 different locations and 2 different technologies and pathways, which is really important from us from a business perspective. But lots of synergies and similarities in terms of whilst it's based in Yarwun and Gladstone, it's still close to port, still supporting those sorts of jobs, fuel security and sovereignty and all those sorts of things. So that's sort of the 2 projects in a nutshell. And as I said, we are the most advanced on Project Ulysses to date in the country in FEED, and Project Mandala has recently completed feasibility, and we're sort of preparing ourselves for the pre-FEED phase at the moment. So also materially progressed.
So how far away are these technologies from being deployed commercially?
The HEFA pathway is already commercially proven. So there's a number of projects globally already producing SAF at scale, and that's across the world. The A2J pathway has very recently been commercially proven at scale with a company called LanzaJet, who's our technology licensor. So LanzaJet has a project in Soperton, Georgia, which produced commercial scale SAF and renewable diesel in November of last year, which was publicly announced. And they're working through sort of the final stages of commissioning at the moment. But I guess I said, they're the 2 most commercialized, HEFA being the most commercialized, and A2J shortly behind that. I think just a quick point to note, though, that Jet Zero is a developer. We're technology agnostic, so we've chosen both the HEFA and the A2J pathway, and in particular LanzaJet, because we believe they're the most commercialized. And for us, it's really about getting molecules into the market as quickly as we possibly can. But the reality is that we want all technologies to work over the longer term. I think from an industry perspective, it's important to be able to utilize various technologies with various feedstocks and deliver what is ultimately important for industry, which is as many of these molecules into the market. But we've been very strategic in selecting what we believe are the most commercialized to date.
And how should policymakers be thinking about these in terms of sort of looking at the projects and the state that they're in and making sure that they get, because I guess it's just it's a question of pilot programs and then bigger and broader programs, and presumably that needs government support at various times. So I mean, I come to you, then I come back to Céline on that one, I think.
Yeah, look, happy to touch on that first. I think the reality is it's really about what outcomes do policymakers or government want to achieve. And so I think it's important for us to have capital available and certain, mechanisms available to be supporting the commercialization of technology. So that might be earlier stage grant funding, probably, lower levels of capital through that, pilot scale or lab scale, pilot scale, et cetera, to be developing the technologies. But then as you get technologies like HEFA and A2J, as I just mentioned earlier, we're now looking to take our projects with those technologies to a final investment decision. And we're talking, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, depending upon the scale of the project. And so that's when we talk about, for example, either larger amounts of grant funding to support, the CapEx costs and ultimately reducing the price of the SAF and renewable diesel that we produce. Or it could be other mechanisms on the supply side, like the Cleaner Fuels Program, for example, which Arena will shortly be releasing with more detail, which is, again, hasn't been released yet, but it could be a CFD or it could be a production credit or a tax incentive. It's really things that can support the revenue side of the equation, which is what the project finance lenders and the sort of equity investors in particular are looking for. So that's a really long way of saying it ultimately depends on what government's trying to achieve, but there are a whole host of different mechanisms, whether that be sort of the supply side in terms of the grants or the other types of mechanisms I mentioned. And then obviously there's the demand side as well, which is really more akin to that sort of the mandates and those sorts of things driving the demand to ensure those projects, once they're producing, are actually delivering those molecules into the market.
Céline, maybe you can give your perspective then, what you're hoping to see from the government perspective, maybe in this ARENA program or just more generally.
Yeah, I mean, as Mac mentioned, different SAF projects will be at different levels of maturity and therefore will require different levels of support. There is a very early stage projects where technology still needs to be de-risked, and I guess in this case, R&D grants are very useful. Then there's a sort of first of a kind projects where capex grants are especially effective. Production subsidies as well to secure FID. And for the more mature technologies, so the HEPFA, as Mac mentioned, I mean, these projects now are at, should be mature enough to be able to attract some institutional investors, sort of funds.
What about the demand side of the equation, the customers? I mean, are you looking for agreements from sort of customers? I mean, corporate travel commitments and booking claim systems or offtake agreements or anything like that? I mean, what's happening here? What do you hope to see happening around the world?
Well, we're seeing a range of things happening. On the voluntary markets, we are seeing more and more corporates committing to some of the airline SAF programs, so that's creating some demand. We are seeing that passengers overall are not totally opposed to it. There was a survey recently by Sydney Airport that showed that most passengers will be okay to contribute to a small premium in exchange for some decarbonisation benefits. And then there is the mandates that also create additional demand. We've seen that in Europe it's been particularly effective to accelerate the development of the industry. And we recently saw that the Australian government will be introducing a consultation for demand side mechanism in Australia, and that would be critical to create that certainty of demand that these projects need to attract the financiers. The financiers want to see that certainty of demand, and the mandates absolutely do that. I'm not saying that's the only thing that a project need. I think supply side subsidies are also very important to be able to lower the cost for customers. But a demand side measure is definitely something that's very important to help the industry, especially in Australia here.
I wonder if I might get a Uber type situation where you can sort of book your sort of electric car or hybrid or sort of fossil fuel car or whatever. Maybe you can make your choice when you're booking flights.
Yeah, that's right.
Why not?
Yeah.
I'm just as way. Certainly from a corporate level, maybe they could make those sort of commitments.
Yep.
Yeah. Jamie, just getting back to something that you mentioned at the start of the podcast about fuel security, and we're sort of feeling fuel security very much at the moment, particularly at the Bowser, sort of petrol and diesel prices. There's a diesel rebate which is probably going to disappear, or maybe has already disappeared by the time this podcast is broadcast. And the government's had to work very, very hard in making sure that it's got sufficient supplies of sort of petrol and diesel for industry and the consumers. So what role does sustainable energy fuels play in this? Because I guess Australia is a vast land, can grow its own crops, produce its own sustainable fuels. And I'll probably get back to Mac after this, and just to clarify that.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. It's the right question as well. Look, Mac briefly touched upon it, but Australia currently imports approximately 90%. I mean, it depends on what numbers you look at, but if you use a rule of thumb, 90% of it's refined liquid fuels. And if you look at LNG as an example, we built a world-leading LNG industry, and it rivals both the US and Qatar. But in the process of doing so, what we didn't do is ensure we had a sufficient amount of reserve capacity for the domestic market. And what we've seen with the recent geopolitical pressures through the Iran war is that Australia is inherently exposed to supply chain disruptions and maritime choke points and potential international refinery closures as well. So from a domestic perspective, SAF doesn't, or low carbon liquid fuels, doesn't just represent energy transition. Actually, it's much a bigger story than that, as you said. It represents sovereign capability, regional development, new agricultural value chains. And really, what we need to be doing is creating a diversified supply source and reducing our reliance on, or our vulnerability essentially, on international shipping markets. And SAF is absolutely part of the puzzle. Obviously, what we need to do is, we're at a disadvantage in that LNG has been established for 80 to 100 years, and as a consequence, it's got already, it's at scale, it's got the infrastructure in place, it's got supply chains, and therefore SAF is at a disadvantage because it's got to establish those, it's got to get to scale, and therefore you'll hear quite a lot, and you probably bring a smile from Céline and Mac when I say this, but it creates what we hear as the green premium, or price parity, where the low carbon liquid fuels industry is trying to create this demand side, an off-taker market, but at the same time, the off-takers, the buyers will say that, well, that's great and we're really interested, but currently we're getting traditional fuels at this price, and we've got no incentive in order to buy it at that, and we can't justify that to our shareholders. And that's where Céline was talking about, and Mac was talking about, having a price floor, a blended fuels mandate is going to be absolutely essential. And I'd just add to that, I think what's a really interesting case is what we saw in California, if you go back to 2011, and what they've achieved over the last 15 years. If you go back to 2011, they were completely on traditional fuel sources. And then they introduced a combination of measures, which essentially represented an additional tax on traditional fuels, and then a tax incentive for low carbon, well, basically renewable diesel. And in the space of those 15 years, it's resulted in the market completely flipping on its head. And now I think it represents something like 86% of the California market. So it demonstrates with the right government policy, you can create both a national security component, you can create a diversified value chain, and you can also, as part of the energy transition, decarbonize the industry as well. But again, it's absolutely essential you have the right policy framework in place.
How much sovereignty can we provide? Or does it provide? Or does it offer?
Yeah, well, I mean, as it stands today, we're not producing any sustainable aviation fuel or renewable diesel. We have a little bit of bioethanol and a little bit of biodiesel, but nothing that, compares to roughly an 8 billion litre jet fuel demand in Australia and a roughly 33 billion litre diesel demand. Like, we're a country that relies on these liquid fuels, these molecules, as we keep saying. For example, Australia is the 8th largest consumer of jet fuel. Now, there's a bit of a tyranny of distance. Obviously, Australia is a very large country. We're a relatively very small population and a little bit isolated from the world. But again, just to sort of give you the context, it's, roughly 8 billion litres, and that's increasing. So as it stands today, if I think about the two projects that Jet Zero is looking to develop, as well as some others that are at a more advanced stage, we're talking about 1.5 to 2 billion litres of SAF or renewable diesel that could be produced in the next, by 2030 or thereabouts, so subject to obviously these policy mechanisms coming into play and us with the ability to accelerate that. But the reality is that, as I think more importantly, Australia has the ability to be a feedstock superpower. And obviously the feedstocks are critical for the ability to develop projects and therefore develop the industry and ultimately reduce that, that fuel vulnerability, as we've just talked about. To give you an example, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, or the CFC, produced a report last year that talked about a $3.9 billion export value that's going offshore for feedstocks to be used in biofuel production today. So we have that ability today effectively to utilize that. Now that's a value perspective, not a volume perspective, but it's all relative. And so there's also the ability to produce or to get further, crops or further feedstocks to support that as well. And it's something that Jet Zero is actually already doing. So we set up a subsidiary business called Silvo Plus a couple of years ago. We have already planted a 10-hectare plantation of a tree called Pongamia, which we believe is a bit of a super crop. And essentially what that does, once the tree grows to maturity, it produces a pod and a seed. The seed can be crushed for oil extraction. The remaining meal that's left over can be utilized for animal feed, and the husk can also be used for bioenergy. And so we've done that plantation. We've got 2 more that we're looking to plant in the next year or so, take all of that data and then commercialize that, and be then planting thousands of hectares of this tree for not only for the output of the biofuel, as we mentioned, or the sort of the feedstock to deliver the biofuel, but importantly, Silvo Plus, as the name, comes from silvo pasture, where basically you're bringing together horticulture, so are you growing trees, as well as the ability for the livestock to be sort of grazing on that land as well. And what we've actually seen is the ability for increasing the carrying capacity of the land for the livestock, because within the interrows of the trees, because you've got nitrogen fixation, carbon sequestration, all of these additional soil benefits actually increases the growth of feed essentially in between the trees as well. So this, we believe, has huge applications for, as I said, not just the biofuel sector and the ability to generate, hundreds of millions, if not billions more litres of fuel in Australia to improve sovereignty, but even from that sort of agricultural perspective and a livestock perspective as well, generating significant value for farmers and landowners.
It's probably just worth sort of sticking there just for a little bit longer there, because one of the big debates around sort of biofuels and things like this is sort of crops versus fuel and things like that. So can you sort of address that sort of question sort of head on and just sort of say, does this mean that we're going to have less food on the table because we're sort of growing things for plain fuel and other sustainable fuels? It sounds from what you're saying about the Pongamia crops and the added value that they can do there, that's not necessary, and particularly in Australia, I guess, because we have so much land area, and Pongamia, I understand, is sort of probably able to be grown on sort of the marginal grazing land. But can you just go straight into that sort of crops versus food versus fuel?
Yeah, look, happy to. Look, it's something that comes up, often when we talk about biofuels, and I think, it's something that Jet Zero and every developer would be very sensitive to. So the way that we look to mitigate any of that risk is essentially using what we call agricultural byproducts. So things that are processing residues or waste streams primarily as our feedstock, as opposed to, things that could be considered or perceived to have, that sort of challenge. I think it was an issue a number of years ago, but these are now very highly regulated markets. So we've got things like RSB, ISCC, Corsia, for example. And so the reality is that there's many jurisdictions in the world that if you aren't abiding by those rules and regulations, you actually won't be able to sell your product either. So, Jet Zero is doing that regardless. Like, we're making sure that we're a very sustainable business and doing things the right way. And ultimately, it's about social license to operate. But that's sort of in a nutshell how we think about the feedstocks we utilize for our projects. As relates to Pongamia specifically, it is a non-edible tree. So it's not something you could ever produce for food. And as I mentioned earlier, what we're actually doing is we're able to increase the ability for food. So in this case, it's livestock, whether it be sheep or cattle, whatever it might be. We're actually increasing the carrying capacity for livestock. We're not removing, there's no deforestation. We're not removing any land that could otherwise be used for food growth. It's, marginal lands or grazing lands. And as I said, we're improving the quality of the land for additional livestock to be feeding on and utilizing the land. So as I say, everything that we do is really about the highest level of sustainability and traceability, because we know that our customers want that at the end of the day.
Yeah, fair enough. Céline, you mentioned about the cost difference between sustainable fuels and the current sort of diesel fuels. Is it large? How do we get it down? What's sort of needed for that to happen? And how are airlines thinking about this?
Look, we are at the moment we're looking at a premium of sort of 2 to 5 times conventional jet fuel. It is a premium that's quite significant for an airline to absorb. Hence the need for these policies. Now, how do we reduce this cost premium? First of all, as Mac mentioned, there's different technologies that are different levels of maturity. There are some technologies, that are commercial and, very well developed, such as the HEFA technology, and others that are still, not as developed and in development. As these other technologies develop, we expect that the costs will come down as well as a de-risk. We expect that scale as well will play a role in helping the SAF price reduce. And at the end of the day, we are, we're very focused on costs, but as we all mentioned, yes, sure, there is a cost premium, but there are also many benefits to SAF. There is the jobs, as Mac mentioned. There is the additional revenue sources for farmers. There is a circularity benefits for certain waste feedstocks that otherwise end up in landfill. So yes, there is a cost premium, and hopefully it will come down over time. But there's also significant benefits associated with SAF as well that we should make sure we focus on as well.
Jamie, maybe we can turn to you again. Just getting some of these projects to financial close. What sort of mechanisms do we need? Sort of banking, funding, finance structures, grants, etc., concessional finance. What do you hope to see?
Yeah, I think all of the above, Giles. It depends where you are on the value chain. So a lot of these projects, as Mac was saying, are around feed or pre-feed. So we're at that early stage where, if you look at the other traditional sources of renewable energy, solar, wind, battery, they all require that early stage grant funding. And ARENA has played a phenomenally important role in that process to where we are in terms of our energy transition today. But as we move through the process and we get closer to FID, and we're looking to bring in, one, you're looking to actually get a sign-off from equity that they can proceed with the project final investment decision, and then also bring in mainstream commercial debt. The importance attached to that is sort of a combination of factors. One, as we talked about already, you need the demand side and correct price signals. And what does that look like? Well, you've got the blended mandate we talked about, and the question then, and we can look abroad into Europe and what's been introduced there. They've currently got a mandate, I think started in 2025 at 2%, and that raises up to I think it's 50% by 2050. And we will need that, because if you look at Project Finance 101, they need clear clarity and sight over cash flows over a sustained period, i.e. the notional debt tenor. So you're looking out between 15 and 20 years. So these mandates can't be aspirational. They actually need to be legislated, and they need to be carefully crafted to actually not put off the industry. Because if they're set too high from the beginning, that actually might set us back. And then in combination with that, there's obviously the front end as well. So that's the grant funding. But I think we're also going to need a combination of production credits. And we're seeing that with the Head Start program already with ARENA. And my strong view is we also need tax incentives as well. Because if you look at the examples in Europe, like the Sky Energy project, on face value, that looks fantastic, and is fantastic because it represents a milestone for the industry. But if you scratch a little bit below the surface, what the problem we have is that in Europe, you have this mandate, this blended mandate, but ultimately, how do you enforce that? Because if you don't have sufficient supply of sustainable fuels, then you're not going to be penalizing the aviation industry. So if you put a tax incentive in place, then that gives the right investment signals to investors early to actually come in. Because the problem with this type of asset class is that usually capital allocators are focused on projects that are already at FID or are completely de-risked. So how do you bring them early in the journey when those developers and sponsors really need the cash and take on a bigger amount of risk they wouldn't normally take? So I think it's going to be a combination of both policy and government's going to have a huge role to play in this. But then from a commercial perspective, yes, we're going to absolutely need concessional lending to be part of the puzzle. So ARENA providing the grant funding, then the Clean Energy Finance or NAIF, or the Reconstruction Fund also being in the mix. And I imagine because of the sheer capital involved in these projects and the scale, you're probably going to get a form of export finance in there too, at least initially as well. So it's going to be all of the above that's going to be able to push this over the line. And I suspect it's going to be like that for the first 2, 3 or 4 projects until we've got established industry. But Ilona, I'd be interested in what your views on particularly the demand side and the government policy setting as well.
Yeah, look, on the policy settings, I think as Jamie, Mac and Céline have all said, it is a matter of all of the above and not one particular policy. You need on the supply side, these, initial policies that support grant funding, subsidies, tax incentives, and also I think certification schemes are very important as well as we look to the way in which we're transforming our approach to product claims. On the demand side, again, we're seeing, SAF mandates come through in a number of jurisdictions. We've mentioned already the EU mandate, but also similarly in the UK, in Brazil, in Singapore, we're seeing these come through. So I think it's really encouraging to see that the Australian government is going to be consulting on these policy choices in coming months. I mean, one thing that I think it's important to also do is sort of step back and look at where this fits in the broader objectives, which are to meet our commitments under the Paris Agreement, to achieve our nationally determined contributions. And in the Australian context, I think the way that Australia has looked at its net zero policy framework and the introduction of sector-based plans is quite telling. And I think importantly, when you step back and look at things like the Transport and Infrastructure Net Zero Roadmap, and the transport sector plan, low carbon liquid fuels, including SAF, are a key component of that. And it's then using that overarching structure to then implement specific policy measures that are going to, in the first instance, support getting projects off the ground and also getting those early investments into the first commercial projects, but then also looking at what that pull side is to have mandates in place. But as Jamie said, I think you've got to be careful in terms of those settings because, if you set the targets too high or are not flexible in the way in which they're achieved, that can undermine the ability to achieve success with those policy settings.
Yeah. And is there any particular country or sort of region, Ilona, that is sort of leading on this, where Australia can sort of draw some lessons and work out what works and what patently doesn't work?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, if we look at the EU, the Refuel EU Aviation Scheme is, as Jamie had said, obliging fuel suppliers to increase their share of SAF at EU airports. And that creates this long-term demand signal for producers. So we're starting at a blending rate in 2025 of 2%, which then rises to 70% by 2050. And these are legally sort of compliance-driven mechanisms that create essentially a demand floor that financiers, can then, see that in terms of their signals to provide pricing. The UK also is starting at 2%, but that is increasing linearly to 10% in 2030 and then 22% in 2040. That's quite an ambitious framework and mandate, particularly given where we see current SAF supply. And so I think, if you look at, other countries around the world, Brazil starting at 1% in 2027, rising to 10% by 2037, and Singapore, currently 1% with an uplift target rising to 3 to 5%. So I think it's just about being measured and flexible in terms of how those targets are set, and also looking at what other complementary measures sit around them. So I think it's interesting when you look at the EU that the aviation sector is also subject to the European Emissions Trading Scheme. And they're sort of focused on, at the moment, in terms of the reform of the next phase of the ETS, looking at how aviation forms part of that scheme going forward, and also how it interacts with other international schemes such as CORSIA, which is the international offsetting scheme for the aviation sector as well. So I think, what we haven't spoken about as much today, but which is very important, is, carbon pricing signals, and importantly, where you can have well-designed carbon pricing mechanisms that are able to also provide that, policy framing that incentivises investment in SAF as opposed to other activities or even, reliance on offsetting.
I'm not too sure Australia's quite ready to have a carbon price, even though the call is still out there. But is there somewhere that we can pretend that we don't have a carbon price, but actually do have a carbon price in our sustainable fuels?
Oh, I won't go into that one today.
That's okay. Céline, what's worked around the world? I mean, Airbus is everywhere around the globe. What have you seen that's worked? And the EU has a carbon price. Has that helped the policies there?
Yeah, look, we've watched the different policies in those different countries that Ilona mentioned very closely. And the great thing about where Australia is at the moment is that, sure, we are a little bit behind when it comes to introducing a policy on a demand-side mechanism. But the great thing is we get to learn about everyone else. We get to learn about, the EU, the UK, Singapore, etc. And so we're not going into this policy blind. We're not the first ones. We are watching very closely what other countries have done, and overall, it's been, it's gone well, and it has achieved the objective of developing the industry. Like we now have SAF in all aircrafts leaving the European Union. This would not have happened without the introduction of the mandate. The voluntary demand sure is there, but it would not have created that sort of volume. So I think Australia is in a great position, and the introduction of that consultation, it will be a very good mechanism for everyone to share what has worked really well and what can be improved, so that when Australia does introduce its demand-side mechanism, it's something that's robust and it's been well thought.
Mac, maybe we can just come back to you because you guys have got projects that you're developing. I mean, what do you need to get them over the line commercially to reach FID, what have you?
Look, there's a whole host of things. I think, look, in a nutshell, any product developer needs to secure their site, secure the approvals. They've got to get a commercial framework for their feedstock supply agreement, their EPC or their construction contract, operations contract, and then the offtake's critical. So again, we're talking very complex projects, but at a high level, they're sort of the key things that you'll need. And then both the supply side and the demand side, working together essentially to support the projects too. So, look, I think there's a lot of positives in Australia at the moment, particularly on the supply side. So the fact that ARENA has a $250 million grant funding program for the sector is really positive, and there was a precursor grant for which we were successful through our feed program. So that's a step in the right direction, absolutely. The announcement end of last year about the Cleaner Fuels program, which at the time was talked about being a production-linked incentive. Again, that hasn't been fully designed and implemented to the market yet, but that's a really strong, case of the willingness to support the sector. And then Jamie touched on it earlier, but there are 4 specialist investment vehicles, so CFC, NAIF, NRF, and EFA, who have the ability to provide really structured capital, so longer tenor, deferred amortization, concessional rates, whatever it might be, as well as just the risk appetite to provide any form of capital to these projects. So Australia's in quite a good, unique position on the supply side in particular. What's lacking today is really that demand mechanism and, let's call it a mandate for lack of a better word. Having said that, the federal government has come out in the budget only a couple of months ago saying that they want to work with industry to develop that. There has been consultation ongoing for a number of years already. And so the next form of consultation, which we believe will be coming out imminently, should be a relatively short process, and then government can make a decision on that. So we're getting very close to having both the supply side and the demand side levers in the market to support that. The question is really then, I guess, exactly how are those structured? And so we often say at Jet Zero that the financial engineering is just as important as the technical engineering, because I might find myself in a situation, again, being the CFO of the business, trying to structure the capital stack of the project, and I've got multiple equity providers, multiple lenders, both private sector as well as the CIVs that I just mentioned. Could be some grants from both federal government, state government. There might be 10 different slices of the capital stack just to get a project away. So look, I've got no issue with that. At the end of the day, whatever capital is required to get the project away, we're happy to do that. But it's really just, as I said, it's quite positive in the Australian market. We've got access to all of these different levers, which is unique compared to other parts of the market. But we just don't have that demand signal yet, but it is coming very soon.
Ilona, the climate benefits of the sustainable aviation fuels, and that's going to be key in communicating that, particularly if we might see, at least initially, sort of a rise in prices and extra costs and what have you. What's your sort of advice in the best way of sort of communicating those sort of issues, avoiding accusations of greenwashing and things like that? How do companies best approach that?
Look, I mean, the aviation sector has been, one of those sectors that has been under a really high level of scrutiny for greenwashing. We've seen over a dozen cases brought between sort of consumer and competition regulators and advertising standard boards, across the UK, the EU, Australia, and the US. And so, this trend is, very, very much an issue that is of concern to airlines across the world. And even in the first half of this year, we've seen significant penalties and corrective orders against airlines in recent greenwashing decisions. So I think it is one of those areas that the approach to claims is really critical. Just by way of example, this month we saw a Danish court impose a fine on KLM for misleading environmental claims made in one of their radio advertisements. And the UK Advertising Standards Board also upheld complaints against both Qatar and Eurowings over their offset mechanisms and their messaging around aviation. So I think, it's important when thinking about how you frame the claims that are being made about SAF to be really careful. And, what we have certainly from the Australian regulator, the ACCC, but also similarly from other regulators globally, is very clear guidance around the approach to making claims. So the ACCC, for example, has 8 key principles. These talk about making accurate and truthful claims, having evidence to back them up, not hiding or omitting important information, explaining conditions and qualifications, avoiding broad and unqualified claims and using clear language, and avoiding imagery that creates the wrong impression. So it's also important to be direct and open about the sustainability transition. And I think those points and guidance are really pertinent when you look at the claims that are being made in respect of aviation and carbon neutral travel or sustainable aviation claims. The ACCC also gives quite a specific warning in respect of aviation. It talks about, a claim that an airline is reducing emissions is likely to mislead in the context of SAF use if the SAF is less than 1% of the airline's, fuel usage. And so I think there is a lot of focus that groups that are challenging and consumers that are challenging claims with respect to aviation will look to, in particular in the context of SAF. One of the things that I think is quite telling is the latest KLM case, because in that case, what KLM were sort of putting forward in their advertisement was that we're taking a big step forward to travel a little more sustainably. We're now using a lot more sustainable aviation fuel in all our tickets, and inviting consumers to purchase additional SAF as well. In that particular case, the court considered the advertisement in light of the broader impacts of aviation travel, and it felt that the court expressed the view that the benefit of adding a percent of SAF was disproportionately negligible to claims being made around a big step. So I think when you're looking at the approach to claims, it's therefore really important to be clear about what the role of SAF is in decarbonisation of the sector, making it clear when the use of SAF is actually physically used or whether it's being used through other means or achieved through other means such as book and claim systems, and also not sort of painting an overly rosy picture or overstating the benefits of where things are at this point in time with SAF usage. So I think it's it's important to highlight that this is an important contributor to decarbonisation in the sector, but just be very careful about how far those claims go in terms of the impression that's given through the use of this as one of a number of means of achieving decarbonisation.
Okay, look, we're just about wrapped up. I'd like just to very briefly at the end of it sort of peer 10 years into the future, and your sort of forecast could be policy, it could be regulatory, it could be technology, it could be the general uptake. You've got 20 to 30 seconds each to sort of say where we're going to be, say 2035 or 2040, pick your year. Jamie, would you like to go first, maybe with...
No pressure. Look, I'm on the project finance side of things. So looking at it from that perspective, I would like to see 3 to 5 projects, particularly max projects, come to financial investment decision and go all the way to COD and is operating. As a consequence, we see a reduction in the domestic consumption of traditional fuels. How much that should look like, that's a difficult one to say. But if you just look, I mean, I mentioned earlier the California model and what they managed to achieve in 15 years. If you use that as a rule of thumb, if we can reduce between 8 to 10%, I think that would be a fantastic outcome for the Australian industry.
Okay, Mac, your turn.
Look, let's call it 2035. I think we'll have 3 projects producing, 2 projects in construction, and I think importantly we'll have some feedstock projects that are also producing those seeds or pods, so essentially the output to be working through those facilities as well. And I think importantly all of that's going to be backed up by very strong policy decisions that enable very long-term investment decisions that ultimately underpin the whole of the industry, and obviously creating fuel security as part of that.
Ilona, your turn.
Okay, well, I will sort of look for a credible, progressively rising demand mechanism that's backed by certification built off the back of the Guarantee of Origin scheme and recognised internationally, ideally through international schemes like Corsia, but also a landscape where we have the infrastructure so that SAF claims are able to be trusted and credible, in particular, again, linked to appropriate registries that track the Guarantee of Origin and certification schemes, and also appropriate double counting standards managed where you are looking across different forms of use.
Celine, no pressure on you, but you've got to bring it home with a 10-year forecast. And then I'm going to say, well, give us a 2050 forecast as well, just for the heck of it. How are we all going to be flying green planes?
Look, I think Australia has everything it needs to become a SAF superpower. It's got all the feedstock, it's got the renewable energy, it's got the stable regulatory regime. At the end of the day, the first-of-a-kind projects are always the hardest ones. And we are currently looking at these first-of-a-kind projects and trying to get them to FID. So by 2035, and assuming we've got a demand-side mechanism being introduced over the next few months, I would expect those first-of-a-kind projects to have, passed FID, which will then trigger the development of many more projects. So by 2035, I would expect quite a few new projects to come on board, and for the Australian industry to be thriving. From a regulatory perspective, I would also expect a robust book and claim system to be put in place, so that we can efficiently make the best use of where the SAF is being produced and being claimed. Through some, very robust and transparent registries, ensuring it's, as Ilona said, avoids double counting and all the potential things that can happen.
Very good. Well, look, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Mac Irvine from Jet Zero. Thanks, Céline Parle from Airbus, Ilona Millar and James Guthrie from Gilbert Tobin. Thank you, Gilbert Tobin, for making this podcast possible. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's fascinating insight into sustainable aviation fuels. We seem to be at the start of the journey, but if some of the other technologies that we've seen and we've become very accustomed to are any indication, then we might be quite surprised by the progress, and let's hope we are. Thank you very much for everyone for listening to this podcast, and that's all for now, and goodbye.
You've been listening to a special episode of Energy Insiders, produced in partnership with Gilbert and Tobin as part of the Financing the Next Phase of the Energy Transition mini-series. To read more analysis and explore the full series, visit the Gilbert and Tobin Beyond Transition Hub.